Growing up and well into my adulthood, I was more of a Christmas person. I related to and proclaimed the Incarnation, God with us as a sweet, cute little infant. I proclaimed Jesus' life, Jesus' healings of people's minds and bodies, such that these formerly ostracized and isolated people were returned to the fold of their communities. I proclaimed Jesus' condemnation of greed and oppression, Jesus' feedings, and Jesus' teachings, that God's love upends the world, the last become first and the first last. I was not really so much an Easter person. Of course, I celebrated Easter, but I didn't really talk about it all that much or relate easily to it or proclaim nearly as authentically resurrection. If somebody asked me about my faith, it wasn't resurrection I was going to, let's put it that way. In all the resurrection stories in the Gospels, doubt is a prominent feature. Last week in John's Gospel, we met again good old doubting Thomas, who simply cannot believe until he has touched Jesus for himself. Today, although none of the disciples voice their doubt out loud, it's there, and Jesus discerns it and invites them to touch him. He eats fish to prove that he's real. In today's gospel, we have the marvelous line, while they were in their joy, they were disbelieving. Mark Davis, an academic who pores over the Greek translations we use, suggests that in the Greek it is actually more like disbelieving from their joy. The intensity of the joy itself leads to disbelief. Try to unpack that one. To proclaim resurrection is most certainly to proclaim the unarguable reality of doubt. But the presence of doubt in the experience of resurrection is not why I was not an Easter person. I am not a person of certitude, as you all know. Quite the opposite. Proclaiming doubt was the comfortable part of resurrection for me. But to fully proclaim resurrection, one can't just proclaim doubt. One can't just proclaim life. To fully proclaim resurrection, one must also proclaim Jesus' death and the suffering he experienced prior to it. To be an Easter people is to proclaim resurrection, new life, not in some vacuum of pure joy, but in doubting joy, and in grief and abandonment and confusion and fear. Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. This portion of Luke's gospel is called the commissioning, though with our 21st century ears, it's pretty darn hard to tell. Jesus doesn't seem to tell the disciples to do anything. He says simply, you are witnesses. The key word to the early Christian church that signifies that this is a directive is the word witnesses. To be a witness in those days was not primarily, as we use the word today, a passive observer. To be a witness in the days of the early church was to allow one's life and actions to testify to the worth and the effect of something. Luke's community understood Christ's parting instructions to be to allow their lives and their actions to demonstrate the worth of Jesus' suffering and rising from the dead, and the worth of the fact that after that, Jesus called for repentance and forgiveness, perhaps rather than for condemnation and retribution. They are not asked to witness to Jesus' life, to Jesus' miraculous healings and altercations with the political power holders, though I am sure they were welcome to. What they were specifically commissioned to is to witness to Jesus' suffering and yet rising again in the face of doubt and fear and grief and hopelessness, proclaiming of all things, given the circumstances, forgiveness. This part this was the uncomfortable part of resurrection for me. Faith communities that focused on suffering, proclaimed suffering, and then proclaimed miraculous rising again, never mind the R word, repentance. They were communities within which many I knew had experienced pain or fear. I worried about the effects of being passionate about suffering, death, and rising from the dead. And yet, just as Christ's first disciples, in every hearing of this gospel, we too, are commissioned as witnesses of these same things. And so, we are compelled to at least ask ourselves, what is the worth in Jesus' suffering and rising again 3 days later? What is important to you about the fact that Jesus suffered, died, and then rose again, proclaiming forgiveness? How or does that influence your life? How or does that impact the way you act in the world? As a person formed in thinking most about how Christ's life matters to me, it took some time and a good bit of discernment committee pushing before I had an authentic answer about why Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection matter to me. Christ's suffering and rising have invaluable worth to me because they teach me that suffering is not the last word. They show me that precisely in the midst of the grief, doubt, confusion, and the fear that this time we really may have been abandoned, that often accompany suffering and both literal and figurative death, new life can rise. New, because it takes on a form we may not recognize, and life, because it is grounded in profound forgiveness. To witness to Christ's suffering and rising is not just to think that these things have worth, though. To truly be an Easter person commissioned by the risen Christ, which I now am, is to allow the immense worth of these things to affect my actions. They must, and they do. Let me give you a few examples. Contemplating the possibility that I would not ultimately be chosen for ordination to the priesthood, it was not Jesus' miracles that I clung to, his ability to change reality, water to wine, not ordination material to ordination material definitely. It was not even his authority to stick it to the religious establishment, which those determining my ordination prospects could sometimes seem an awful lot like. What sustained me was the Easter truth that were I not to be chosen, God would provide me with some form of new life, even in the midst of the grief and confusion that I would surely feel. Similarly, sitting alongside any of you who find yourselves in the midst of illness or grief, who face your own deaths, who have been overtaken by the tidal wave of addiction again and again and again, it is not Jesus' life I want to tell you about. It is not his miraculous healings, or the little girl he raised from the dead, or the 5,000 people he fed from just a few loaves and a couple of fish. It is not some assurance that he will swoop in and cure you. What I want to tell you about is the personal way he knows fear and grief and physical pain, the shaking of the heavens and the earth at his death. It's the awe and, yes, the disbelieving joy in those who met his risen self that I want to tell you about, or the invitation to come back home to God and to be bathed in forgiveness. To be a Christmas person only is to risk witnessing a hope that is grounded only in the miraculous. To be an Easter person, an Easter people, is to allow both the incarnation, God with us, and the resurrection to have worth, to characterize our actions and reactions, to not only burst forth with the power of Jesus' life, but also to warmly cradle fear and doubt as we wait together for new life. Thus it is written that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. We are witnesses of these things. Amen.